Today's story is called God, God Calls Abram. It comes with this material and it comes with a covenant box. This one says the gift of the covenant, but it is the same thing. However, later covenant boxes will have more objects in them. When God first calls Abram in Genesis 12, he gives him the promise of a new home and that he will be a blessing to all the nations in the world. So it also has a crown and a cardstock tag. Our story today comes from God's true book, the Bible. We have been studying stories in the book of Genesis. Genesis is at the beginning of the Bible. Genesis means beginnings. We've talked about the beginning of creation, the beginning of people and animals, and the sad story about the beginning of sin when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. We've heard about the story of the flood and Noah and how God saved Noah and gave him the rainbow promise that never again would he flood the world. Today's story comes from Genesis chapter 12. When you go home today, you might want to read it. Our story today is about a man and his wife that even today people know his name all over the world and know his name is not Jesus. Listen carefully and you will know his name and what is so important about him. This man, Abram, lived in a desert area. There was some water, there were rivers nearby, but mostly it was very much a rocky desert place. Abram's wife was Sarah, and Abram was a very wealthy man. In Bible times, if you were wealthy, it meant you had lots and lots of animals. All around Abram were people who worshiped gods that they saw, gods that they made up, not true gods. They worshiped the god of the sun, the god of the rain. They made up all kinds of gods. But unlike them, Abram and Sarah worshiped the one true God. Sarah was a very beautiful woman. Abram and Sarah were well known all over their town of Haran, but in some ways, they were very poor. They had no children. And they were quite old by this time. Abram was 75 and his wife was 65, far past the time of having children. One day, God spoke to Abram, and he had a very special message for him. And it comes from Genesis chapter 12, the first few verses. And it was a gift to him. So that's why it's in this beautiful box. And God said to Abram, go from your country to a land that I will give you. God was giving him a new home. Go, move away from where you are, and I will give you a new home. And he said, Abram, you're going to be the father of nations. It's like he was going to be a king and be the head of many countries, of many nations. And he said, you are going to be a blessing to the nations. Wow. A blessing to the whole world. How could that be? Didn't that mean he would have lots of children to make a nation? And he had no children. But nowhere in the Bible does it say Abram didn't believe God. It says that Abram obeyed him. He obeyed him when God said, go from your country and your family and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And today, most everyone in the world knows Abram's name, or Abraham as he was later called. So Abram came back and told his wife, and I'm sure it was hard for them to finally decide it was time to leave. But they said goodbye to their families and they packed up. When they said goodbye to their family in Haran, they knew they would never see them again. People in Bible days did not travel back and forth when it was too far away. So Abram and Sarah packed up everything. They took their animals. They took their servants. They even took a relative with them. But everyone else they said goodbye to. And they headed out to the land that Abram had never seen, to a land to which he really didn't know the directions, but God was going to lead him. Each day they traveled slowly because they had so many animals. They stayed by water, probably the Euphrates River, as they traveled, so that the animals would have water, and so would they. Each night they had to set up their tent, and each morning they had to put it away. And they traveled and traveled, day after day. They didn't know how long it would be until they got where they were going. But finally, they came to a place called Shechem. And there, God said to Abram, I am going to give you this land. Abram wanted to remember that. He needed places to remember now, because it had been a while since God had given him his promise that he would make him a blessing to the world. So Abram gave God a sacrifice. He built an altar, and he put a lamb on it, and he killed it, and he worshiped God. Abram made Shechem a place to remember God's promises. It was so important to remember what God said as Abram was on his journey. They continued on and on, packing up their things and unpacking them, and walking and walking. And they came to another town called Bethel. Here again, Abram was so glad to be in a place that had people in it, that was a town. And there he sacrificed to God again. He built an altar, and he gave God another animal and killed it on the altar. And again, he wanted to remember it. You know what's interesting about this story is that in all of Abram's life, he never had a home. He always lived in a tent. He always wandered. And yet he believed the promise that God was going to give him a new home called the Promised Land. And all along that journey, Abram wanted to remember the times that God spoke to him and to see how he was keeping his promise. The Bible says later on in the New Testament of the Bible, it says, Abram did these things by faith, even though he never really saw himself lead a great nation and have many, many people be in his nation. He believed by faith, and he left Haran, and he traveled to this promised land by faith. And God said because it was of his faith, God counted him as righteous. It wasn't even because he was a good man and he worshiped the one true God. It was because he had faith in God. And that was why he worshiped the one true God. And God counted it to him as righteousness.